For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Did you know that till 1999, the budget used to be presented at 5 p.m.? Did you know that of the nearly rupees 45 lakh crore that the government proposes to spend next year, nearly 3/4 is preempted by interest payments, wages, salaries, etc.? Did you know that in recent memory, this is the first pre-election budget that is not populist? Welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I am your host, Anil Padmanabhan. On 1st February, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented a fifth consecutive budget. It was a rare budget which met with little or no criticism. Yet, it marked continuity with change. The Finance Minister launched India's ambitious 25-year growth plan to transition India's economy into an upper middle income economy. To understand the implications of these changes and more, and to look under the hood as it were, we spoke to Sanjeev Sanyal. Sanjeev is an economist and an old hand in the Ministry of Finance. At present, he is a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. I began by asking Sanjeev as to what exactly he believed were the biggest takeaways in this year's Union Budget.
I think it's a continuation of the general strategy that has been used for several years. So it has the following ingredients. First of all, macroeconomic stability is a key thing. This government is a conservative on that front. You saw that even in the peak of COVID, they maintain macroeconomic stability. So what they're signaling is that we're going to do a 0.5 percentage point cut in the fiscal deficit in this year. And we will continue to take that towards that 4.5% range, probably doing 0.5 percentage points every year and get it there. So that was the first clear sign that no populism or any other thing just because revenues are going up and election happened to be there. No, we maintain that. So that's takeaway number one. Second thing is continuing with the general supply side approach that has always been the case. This government is very much a supply side oriented government. So yes, spending needs to be done, but it has to be done on infrastructure. So there has been over several years a clear shift away towards capital spending. Why? Well, first of all, infrastructure spending has lots of multiplier effects. So that is just it's a fact that is well documented. It creates jobs. It has multiplier effects of all kinds. But also, since, as I said, this is a supply side government and a supply side oriented economic strategy, infrastructure also enhances the supply side of the economy. It leaves behind assets that are good in their own rights. There is, of course, the yet further out multiplier effects in terms of private investment and crowding in and all that. But even if you ignore that, the infrastructure is a good thing in its own right. Whether you're building highways or airports or whatever it is, they are used in their own right. So that is the second important thing. The third important thing is you will see, and this is very often doesn't catch people's eyes as much, is that there is a systematic emphasis on process simplification and reform. So obviously the one that everybody discusses is the encouragement and inducement to move to the simpler tax system on the income tax front. But in fact, there are all these tiny things in there which are also mentioned. For example, for KYC, you create a DigiLocker, move everything onto it and simplify. So this sort of thing, process reform, is something that keeps happening all the time and they eventually accumulate. So again, you will see a lot of those. So those will be, if I had to really summarize it, those three themes that are old themes but have again come through in this budget.
So, Sanjeev, from your summary, I'm sure you're not surprised that this budget passed on populism and went on a 25-year blueprint on how to trade India up into at least a middle income economy.
Not at all. In fact, this is exactly what has been attempted for quite some time. If you see what has been going on, look at the reforms that are getting systematically done. Some of them painful reforms. GST is not a fun reform to do, let me tell you, as somebody who was there when it happened. Insolvency and bankruptcy code, very painful long-term reform. Whenever you introduced it, you are going to be painful. Again, as somebody who had something to do with kind of implementing it, let me tell you, very painful thing to do, taking large companies, taking them through insolvency. And of course, in each one of these things, there is, when you introduce them, there is confusion, there are inefficiencies when you introduce them, you have to fix them. Same thing with, anchoring our macroeconomic system to a inflation targeting framework. All of these, by the way, are all deflationary policies. So, normally nobody would be doing these things all in one shot if you didn't believe in the medium term. And then there are all these other small reforms. Again, I'll come back to the small reforms issue because everybody remembers the big ones. But there are all these small reforms. Even in the height of COVID, look at what was happening. The space sector got open. The drone sector got open. The geospatial sector got open. All the old telecom regulations on the OSP, BPO sector got removed. A little bit before COVID, you had bilateral netting. Now, bilateral netting is extremely esoteric thing and nobody on earth would care about it. But these are things, bells and whistles that are continuously getting done. They're still getting done. Right now, we are doing, not in the budget, but we are doing a big expansion of the patent system in the country. I've written about this extensively, you may have seen. So, point is, these bells and whistles are continuously getting done. The budget is, of course, primarily a fiscal exercise, but it does reflect a wider view, upgrade things, modernize things, simplify things, and just be at it.
A key argument made by Sanjeev is that the grammar of governance has changed. It is one that prefers empowerment over entitlement, teaching people how to fish instead of handing them the fish.
Absolutely. So, one is, of course, this big emphasis on modernization and supply side, which I talked about. But even when we are dealing with the poor, there is a very different approach towards dealing with the poor. So, for example, the emphasis is not on inequality, but on absolute poverty. So, you see direct interventions being done in order to provide a safety net and dealing with absolute poverty. So, whether it's building toilets or providing gas or providing some sort of a safety net on the medical front through insurance, all of these are safety nets dealing with absolute poverty and empowering people to then move up the value chain. And meanwhile, while you're doing that safety net, you continuously build out infrastructure and other things. So, for example, a lot of this infrastructure is not just that infrastructure is being built. Look at where it's being built, right? The Northeast, Eastern UP. These are parts of the country where the poor live. So this is where the massive expansion of infrastructure is being done. Even in big cities when it's being done, let's say in Mumbai, you see this is big mass infrastructure, which the rich can of course use, but the poor can also use. So this is a very different approach than this entitlement approach. I mean, the entitlement approach only looks good for the entitled living in the east coast of the US and lecturing us what to do. Yeah, so the idea here is, as I said, I keep coming back to the point. This is very much about an aspirational India. It's about an India that we are encouraging to go out there and become job creators as opposed to come to Sarkari type jobs. But at the same time, we recognize that there is a part of the country that requires support. That even if you take risks, they will slip sometimes. So very much about creating safety nets. And by the way, the best example of that is our response to COVID. So there we were in the middle of COVID, chaos as far as information from the global, WHO and China, etc. is concerned. We don't have information. Supply chains are breaking down. We have to ourselves do all kinds of things, quarantines, lockdowns, etc. In the middle of that, lots of pressure from so-called international experts. Go out there and spend, right? Because their entire worldview is driven by a demand-driven approach. Whereas we saw the COVID shock largely as a supply side shock. And so our approach was, what's the point of going out there and pressing the accelerator when we are ourselves pressing the brake on through lockdowns and other things? It's not that people didn't want to spend money. We are stopping them from spending money by shutting down the malls and restaurants and so on. So our approach always was create a safety net. Make sure nobody slips through. So the safety net was done for the poor through providing provision of free food to 800 million people, transferring through small amounts of money to make sure everybody has some cash with them, so nobody is left without cash. And we did that with the same thing with the business sector. There we just provided all these guarantees. Rather than spending money, we provided a guarantee, a safety net. So what happens here is that we make sure that you survive the cycle. And then when the cycle comes out, when you open it, that's when we began, doing spending on infrastructure, etc., to get the economy going. And at every stage, even through all the problems of COVID, pandemic, etc., we were criticized for this, but we kept doing supply side reform.
Undoubtedly, the biggest headline this year were the tax changes for the middle class. However, the subtext of this change was very important. It now allows the middle class to choose how and where they will invest and save. Going by the surge in their participation in the stock markets, especially if you look at the demat numbers, this freedom to choose may have been well timed.
It's again a part of the same sort of right of center thinking process that you don't infantilize the average citizen. The idea here is, look, provide freedom, provide information, and yes, don't do it suddenly, because obviously people have committed in some time and there is an information gathering time. There's a time for getting used to the new system. So provide time for shifting, but don't infantilize the average citizen. The old approach at a very philosophical level, what I like to call it the Ashokan approach to economics, is that the government is some sort of a my-baap. It knows best. And for some reason, whether it's the planning commission or the minister or the bureaucrat in charge knows what is good for the people of this country, and they will then incentivize people to move on to that. That, in my view, is exactly this Ashokan approach. If you read Ashoka's edicts, he says, no, my people are like my children, and just like just like parents hand their children to the wet nurse, in the same way I have handed over my people to the Dharma Mahamantas. It's the same kind of thinking process, Mai Baap Sarkar. So we clearly don't believe in the Mai Baap Sarkar. We want, citizens should by and large be, they can provide some nudge here and there, but by and large they should make their own decisions and get on with it.
But the quick follow-up for that, given the history that over 7 decades it's been a Mai Baap Sarkar, now you suddenly say there's an option for you. So is there a risk that the middle class may not be ready, or this is it's a very different demography. There are a lot of young people out there, so they're not carrying any baggage.
So there has to be certain amount of transition. So that is why we are allowing for both of them. If you notice, we have not shut down one. We have created another option. Over time, people will move on to it. But that doesn't mean we are forcing people to do that. And by the way, people can continue. If they want to allocate according to that, they can continue doing so. But a simpler system is just simpler for everybody.
But they are very interestingly, the FM said that when you open the income tax page, the default option is this. So in behavioral economics, the default option is often the final option.
Yes, so we have given a simple system and made it the default. So now if people want to move to do something else and they prefer the old system, they are very welcome to continue using the old system. And many people may indeed find it either better or they are more used to it, they can continue using it. The default option, by the way, given the demographics of this country and the fact that most of tomorrow's middle class is not yet in the middle class today, either because they are too young or they haven't yet moved into that zone. So rather than get locked into some old, socialist era kind of thinking where the bureaucrat tells you where to invest your money, we will move people out to a more free system. Simple, let people make their decisions.
This freedom of decision making is being extended to the middle class at a time when they have assumed a critical mass. Going forward, their role in India's polity will only grow.
Certainly is the case that the middle class is no longer a small group of people, it's a sizable group of people. Also remember, being in the middle class is aspiration. So even those who are not in the middle class, they are beginning to develop middle class attitudes. This sort of thing happens, by the way, in many societies when they transition into the middle class. A lot of it develop middle class attitudes before they end up in the middle class. They begin to place weightage on education or certain kinds of behavior patterns, which are very middle class before they actually transition to it. So it's not the case that you have to actually become middle class. And it is, in fact, happening across the country. Certain kinds of aspirations and so on are very, very middle class aspirations, even with people who may not otherwise be considered middle class. So actually, that middle classization of India is definitely happening. And it gets reinforced by other things, whether it's media or, social media, even faster, because they are now sort of self-reinforcing, and not top-down way, but across from each other. So there is lots of this middle classization happening, and of course that will influence many things. It will influence consumer behavior. It will influence social behavior. It will influence political voting and behavior. All kinds of things. Of course, there'll be all kinds of unintended outcomes as well, because do remember that they're also interacting with technology and other things that are changing.
It is then clear that this year's union budget delivered the rare combination: good politics and good economics. However, the biggest headline or the takeaway was about cutting the middle class loose, their coming of age moment. As the cult movie DDLJ, a dialogue where a father tells his teenage daughter, "Ja Simran ja, ji le apni zindagi." Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to Strat News Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.